The Victorian era of British history was the period of Queen Victoria's reign from the 20th of June 1837 until her death, on the 22nd of January 1901. It was a long period of peace, prosperity, refined sensibilities and national self-confidence for Britain. Some scholars date the beginning of the period in terms of sensibilities and political concerns to the passage of the Reform Act 1832. Within the fields of social history and literature, Victorianism refers to the study of late Victorian attitudes and culture with a focus on the highly moralistic, straight-laced language and behaviour of Victorian morality. The era followed the Georgian period and preceded the Edwardian period. The later half of the Victorian age roughly coincided with the first portion of the Belle Epoque era of continental Europe. Culturally, there was a transition away from the rationalism of the Georgian period and toward romanticism and mysticism with regard to religion, social values, and arts. In international relations, the era was a long period of peace, known as the Pax Britannica, and economic, colonial, and industrial consolidation, temporarily disrupted by the Crimean War in 1854. The end of the period saw the Boer War. Domestically, the agenda was increasingly liberal, with a number of shifts in the direction of gradual political reform, industrial reform and the widening of the voting franchise. Two especially important figures in this period of British history are the Prime Ministers Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone, whose contrasting views changed the course of history. Disraeli, favoured by the Queen, was a gregarious Tory. His rival Gladstone, a liberal distrusted by the Queen, served more terms and oversaw much of the overall legislative development of the era. The population of England and Wales almost doubled from 16.8 million in 1851 to 30.5 million in 1901. Scotland's population also rose rapidly, from 2.8 million in 1851 to 4.4 million in 1901. Ireland's population, however, decreased sharply, from 8.2 million in 1841 to less than 4.5 million in 1901, mostly due to the Great Famine. At the same time, around 15 million emigrants left the United Kingdom in the Victorian era, settling mostly in the United States, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia. During the early part of the era, the House of Commons was headed by the two parties, the Whigs and the Conservatives. For the late 1850s onwards, the Whigs became the Liberals. These parties were led by many prominent statesmen including Lord Melbourne, Sir Robert Peel, Lord Derby, Lord Palmerston, William Ewart Gladstone, Benjamin Disraeli, and Lord Salisbury. The unsolved problems relating to Irish Home Rule played a great part in politics in the later Victorian era, particularly in view of Gladstone's determination to achieve a political settlement. Political and diplomatic history. Progress. Victoria became Queen in 1837 at age 18. Her long reign until 1901 was generally characterized mostly by peace and prosperity. There were no great wars. Britain reached the zenith of its economic, political, diplomatic and cultural power. The era saw the expansion of the Second British Empire. Historians have characterized the mid-Victorian era as Britain's golden years. There was prosperity, as the national income per person grew by half. Much of the prosperity was due to the increasing industrialization, especially in textiles and machinery, as well as to the worldwide network of trade and engineering that produced profits for British merchants and exports from across the globe. There was peace abroad, and social peace at home. Opposition to the new order melted away, says Porter. The Chartist movement peaked as a democratic movement among the working class in 1848. Its leaders moved to other pursuits, such as trade unions and cooperative societies. The working class ignored foreign agitators like Karl Marx in the midst and joined in celebrating the new prosperity. Employers typically were paternalistic and generally recognized the trade unions. Companies provided their employees with welfare services ranging from housing, schools and churches, to libraries, baths, and gymnasia. Middle-class reformers did their best to assist the working classes aspire to middle-class norms of respectability. There was a spirit of libertarianism, says Porter, as people felt they were free. Taxes were very low, and government restrictions were minimal. There were still problem areas, such as occasional riots, especially those motivated by anti-Catholicism. Society was still ruled by the aristocracy and the gentry, which controlled high government offices, both houses of parliament, the church, and the military. Becoming a rich businessman was not as prestigious as inheriting a title and owning a landed estate. Literature was doing well, but the fine arts languished as the Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased Britain's industrial prowess rather than its sculpture, painting and music. The educational system was mediocre. The capstone universities were likewise mediocre. Historian Llewellyn Woodward has concluded, for leisure or work, forgetting or spending, England was a better country in 1879 than in 1815. The scales were less weighted against the weak, against women and children, and against the poor. There was greater movement, and less of the fatalism of an earlier age. The public conscience was more instructed, and the content of liberty was being widened to include something more than freedom from political constraint. Yet England in 1871 was by no means an earthly paradise. The housing and conditions of life of the working class in town and country were still a disgrace to an age of plenty. Population in the Victorian era. The Victorian era was a time of unprecedented demographic increase in Britain. The population rose from 13.9 million in 1831 to 32.5 million in 1901. Two major factors affecting population growth are fertility rates and mortality rates. Britain was the first country to undergo the demographic transition and the agricultural and industrial revolutions. Britain had the lead in rapid economic and population growth. At the time, Thomas Malthus believed this lack of growth outside Britain was due to the Malthusian trap, that is, the tendency of a population to expand geometrically while resources grew more slowly, reaching a crisis which would reduce the population to a sustainable size. Britain escaped the Malthusian trap because the Industrial Revolution had a positive impact on living standards. People had more money and could improve the standards, therefore, a population increase was sustainable. Fertility rates. In the Victorian era, fertility rates increased in every decade until 1901, when the rate started evening out. There are several reasons for the increase in birth rates. One is biological. With improving living standards, the percentage of women who were able to have children increased. Another possible explanation is social. In the 19th century, the marriage rate increased, and people were getting married at a very young age until the end of the century, when the average age of marriage started to increase again slowly. The reasons why people got married younger and more frequently are uncertain. One theory is that greater prosperity allowed people to finance marriage and new households earlier than previously possible. With more births within marriage, it seems inevitable that marriage rates and birth rates would rise together. Birth rates were originally measured by the crude birth rate, births per year in population per every 1,000 people. This is thought not to be accurate enough, as key groups and the fertility rates are not clear. It also does not take into account population changes, e.g., same number of births in a smaller population. It was then changed to the net reproduction rate, which only measured the fertility rate of women who were capable of giving birth. The evening out of fertility rates at the beginning of the 20th century was mainly the result of a few big changes: availability of forms of birth control, and changes in people's attitude towards sex. Mortality rates. The mortality rates in England changed greatly through the 19th century. There was no catastrophic epidemic or famine in England or Scotland in the 19th century. It was the first century in which a major epidemic did not occur throughout the whole country, with deaths per 1,000 of population per year in England and Wales dropping from 21.9 from 1848 to 54 to 17 in 1901. Class had a significant effect on mortality rates, as the upper classes had a lower rate of premature death early in the 19th century than poorer classes did. Environmental and health standards rose throughout the Victorian era. Improvements in nutrition may also have played a role, although the importance of this is debated. Sewage works were improved, as was the quality of drinking water. With a healthier environment, diseases were caught less easily and did not spread as much. Technology was also improving because the population had more money to spend on medical technology, which also led to a greater number of cures for diseases. However, a cholera epidemic took place in London in 1848–49, killing 14,137, and subsequently in 1853 killing 10,738. This anomaly was attributed to the closure and replacement of cesspits by the modern London sewerage system. Tuberculosis, lung diseases from the mines, and typhoid were also common. High culture. Gothic revival architecture became increasingly significant during the period, leading to the battle of the styles between Gothic and classical ideals. Charles Barry's architecture for the new Palace of Westminster, which had been badly damaged in an 1834 fire, was built in the medieval style of Westminster Hall, the surviving part of the building. It constructed a narrative of cultural continuity, set in opposition to the violent disjunctions of revolutionary France. A comparison common to the period, as expressed in Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution, A History in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, and A Tale of Two Cities. Gothic was also supported by critic John Ruskin, who argued that it epitomized communal and inclusive social values, as opposed to classicism, which he considered to epitomize mechanical standardization. The middle of the 19th century saw the Great Exhibition of 1851, the first World's Fair, which showcased the greatest innovations of the century. At its center was the Crystal Palace, a modular glass and iron structure, the first of its kind. It was condemned by Ruskin as the very model of mechanical dehumanization in design, but later came to be presented as the prototype of modern architecture. The emergence of photography, showcased at the Great Exhibition, resulted in significant changes in Victorian art, with Queen Victoria being the first British monarch to be photographed. John Everett Miller was influenced by photography, as were other pre-Raphaelite artists. It later became associated with the impressionistic and social realist techniques that would dominate the later years of the period in the work of artists such as Walter Sickert and Frank Holl. The middle class. Industrialization brought with it a rapidly growing middle class whose increase in numbers had a significant effect on the social strata itself, cultural norms, lifestyle, values and morality. Identifiable characteristics came to define the middle-class home and lifestyle. Previously, in town and city, residential space was adjacent to or incorporated into the worksite, virtually occupying the same geographical space. The difference between private life and commerce was a fluid one, distinguished by an informal demarcation of function. In the Victorian era, English family life increasingly became compartmentalized. The home, a self-contained structure or housing a nuclear family extended according to need and circumstance to include blood relations. The concept of privacy became a hallmark of the middle-class life. The English home closed up and darkened over the decade, the cult of domesticity matched by a cult of privacy. Bourgeois existence was a world of interior space, heavily curtained off and wary of intrusion, and opened only by invitation for viewing on occasions such as parties or teas. The essential unknowability of each individual, and society's collaboration in the maintenance of a facade behind which lurked innumerable mysteries, were the themes which preoccupied many mid-century novelists. Journalism. There were four major factors that radically transformed newspapers in 19th-century Britain. First, by the 1830s the government had ended very high taxes and lifted severe legal restraints. Second, new machines, especially the rotary press, allowed the printing of tens of thousands of copies a day at a low cost. Third, the newspapers reached out to new readers in multiple ways, including features, illustrations, and advertisements that enlarged the audience. Finally, the franchise was expanded from 1 or 2% of the men to a majority, and newspapers became the primary means of political education. In 1817, Thomas Barnes became general editor of the Times. He was a political radical, a sharp critic of parliamentary hypocrisy and a champion of freedom of the press. Under Barnes and his successor in 1841, John Thaddeus Delane, the influence of the Times rose to great heights, especially in politics and in the financial district. It spoke for reform. The Times originated the practice of sending war correspondents to cover particular conflicts. W.H. Russell wrote immensely influential dispatches on the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. For the first time the public could read about the reality of warfare. Russell wrote one dispatch that highlighted the surgeon's humane barbarity and the lack of ambulance care for wounded troops. Shocked and outraged, the public reacted in a backlash that led to major reforms, especially in the provision of nursing, led by Florence Nightingale. The Manchester Guardian was founded in Manchester in 1821 by a group of nonconformist businessmen. Its most famous editor, Charles Prestwich Scott, made the Guardian into a world-famous newspaper in the 1890s. The Daily Telegraph in 1856 became the first penny newspaper in London. It was funded by advertising revenue based on a large audience. Leisure opportunities for leisure activities increased dramatically as real wages continued to grow and hours of work continued to decline. In urban areas, the 9-hour workday became increasingly the norm. The 1874 Factory Act limited the workweek to 56.5 hours, encouraging the movement toward an eventual 8-hour workday. Furthermore, a system of routine annual vacations came into play, starting with white-collar workers and moving into the working class. Some 200 seaside resorts emerged thanks to cheap hotels and inexpensive railway fares. Widespread banking holidays and the fading of many religious prohibitions against secular activities on Sundays. By the late Victorian era, the leisure industry had emerged in all cities. It provided scheduled entertainment of suitable length at convenient locales at inexpensive prices. These included included sporting events, music halls, and popular theatre. By 1880, football was no longer the preserve of the social elite, as it attracted large working-class audiences. Average gate attendance was 5,000 in 1905, rising to 23,000 in 1913. That amounted to 6 million paying customers with a weekly turnover of £400,000. Sports by 1900 generated some 3% of the total gross national product. Professional sports were the norm, although some new activities reached an upscale amateur audience, such as lawn tennis and golf. Women were now allowed in some sports, such as archery, tennis, badminton and gymnastics. Entertainment. Popular forms of entertainment varied by social class. Victorian Britain, like the periods before it, was interested in literature, theatre and the arts, and music, drama, and opera were widely attended. Michael Balfe was the most popular British head opera composer of the period, while the most popular musical theatre was a series of 14 comic operas by Gilbert and Sullivan, although there was also musical burlesque and the beginning of Edwardian musical comedy in the 1890s. Drama ranged from low comedy to Shakespeare. There were, however, other forms of entertainment. Gentlemen went to dining clubs, like the Beefsteak Club of the Savage Club. Gambling at cards in establishments popularly called casinos was wildly popular during the period, so much so that evangelical and reform movements specifically targeted such establishments in their efforts to stop gambling, drinking, and prostitution. Brass bands and the bandstand became popular in the Victorian era. The bandstand was a simple construction that not only created an ornamental focal point, but also served acoustic requirements whilst providing shelter from the changeable British weather. It was common to hear the sound of a brass band whilst strolling through parklands. At this time, musical recording was still very much a novelty. The Victorian era marked the golden age of the British circus. Astley's amphitheatre in Lambeth, London, featuring equestrian acts in a 42-foot wide circus ring, was the epicentre of the 19th-century circus. The permanent structure sustained 3 fires but as an institution lasted a full century, with Andrew Ducrow and William Batty managing the theatre in the middle part of the century. William Batty would also build his own 14,000-person arena, known commonly as Batty's Hippodrome, in Kensington Gardens and draw crowds from the Crystal Palace exhibition. Travelling circuses, like Pablo Fank's, dominated the British provinces, Scotland, and Ireland. Fank also stands out as a black man who achieved great success and enjoyed great admiration among the British public only a few decades after Britain had abolished slavery. Another form of entertainment involved spectacles where paranormal events, such as mesmerism, communication with the dead, ghost conjuring and the like, were carried out to the delight of crowds and participants. Such activities were more popular at this time than in other periods of recent Western history. Natural history became increasingly an amateur activity, particularly in Britain and the United States. This grew into specialist hobbies such as the study of birds, butterflies, seashells, beetles and wildflowers. Amateur collectors and natural history entrepreneurs played an important role in building the large natural history collections of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Middle-class Victorians used the train services to visit the seaside, helped by the Bank Holiday Act of 1871, which created a number of fixed holidays. Large numbers travelling to quiet fishing villages such as Worthing, Brighton, Morecambe and Scarborough began turning them into major tourist centres, and people like Thomas Cook saw tourism and even overseas travel as viable businesses. Technology and engineering. The Victorians were impressed by science and progress and felt that they could improve society in the same way as they were improving technology. Britain was the leading world centre for advanced engineering and technology. Its engineering firms were in worldwide demand for designing and constructing railways. A central development during the Victorian era was the improvement of communication. The new railways all allowed goods, raw materials, and people to be moved about, rapidly facilitating trade and industry. The financing of railways became an important specialty of London's financiers. Trains became an important factor ordering society, with railway time being the standard by which clocks were set throughout Britain, and with the complex railway system setting the standard for technological advances and efficiency. Steamships such as the SS Great Britain and SS Great Western made international travel more common but also advanced trade, so that in Britain it was not just the luxury goods of earlier times that were imported into the country but essentials and raw materials such as corn and cotton from the United States and meat and wool from Australia. One more important innovation in communications was the penny black, the first postage stamp, which standardized postage to a flat price regardless of distance sent. Even later communication methods such as electric power, telegraph, and telephones had an impact. Photography was realized in 1839 by Louis Daguerre in France and William Fox Talbot in Britain. By 1889, handheld cameras were available. Similar sanitation reforms, prompted by the Public Health Act's Chapter 1848 and 1869, were made in the crowded, dirty streets of the existing cities, and soap was the main product shown in the relatively new phenomenon of advertising. A great engineering feat in the Victorian era was the sewage system in London. It was designed by Joseph Bazalgette in 1858. He proposed to build 82 miles of sewer system linked with over 1,000 miles of street sewers. Many problems were encountered but the sewers were completed. After this, Bazalgette designed the Thames Embankment, which housed sewers, water pipes and the London Underground. During the same period, London's water supply network was expanded and improved, and a gas network for lighting and heating was introduced in the 1880s. The model town of Saltaire was founded, along with others, as a planned environment with good sanitation and many civic, educational and recreational facilities, although it lacked a pub, which was regarded as a focus of dissent. During the Victorian era, science grew into the discipline it is today. In addition to the increasing professionalism of university science, many Victorian gentlemen devoted their time to the study of natural history. This study of natural history was most powerfully advanced by Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, first published in his book On the Origin of Species in 1859. Although initially developed in the early years of the 19th century, gas lighting became widespread during the Victorian era in industry, homes, public buildings and the streets. The invention of the incandescent gas mantle in the 1890s greatly improved light output and ensured its survival as late as the 1960s. Hundreds of gasworks were constructed in cities and towns across the country. In 1882, incandescent electric lights were introduced to London streets, although it took many years before they were installed everywhere.